It's an enormous topic, but I find myself starting here. Have we finally arrived at a tipping point in the fight against Islamic terrorism? You had many Muslims join in the march in Paris. Iran condemned the attacks. Hamas, Hezbollah condemned the attacks. Where are we on this very long and painful continuum? Let's talk about it this morning with Dawud Walid. Good to have back with us the Executive Director of the Michigan Chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Columnist for the Detroit Free Press, Rochelle Riley, is back with us again. Saeed Khan is the Professor of Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University. Saeed, thank you for coming this morning. And good to have with us again the host of the Frank Beckman Show every weekday morning on the great voice of the Great Lakes, WJR. Frank, thanks for coming this morning.
Great to be here.
Dawud, let me start with you a little bit, and let's start with that the question that I posed there at the beginning. Do you see a tipping point finally happening, or are we still in the middle of the wilderness, so to speak?
Well, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of cases that have hit media in recent years regarding killings of people, and the vast majority of these actually have been people of the Islamic faith, in which extremists trying to play out their own ideological beefs or for political reasons have targeted Muslims, just as what happened, the tragedy in northern Nigeria when there were about 2,000 Muslims who were killed
by being the wrong kind of Muslim.
Yeah, by being from Boko Haram. So this is an issue that's on the concern of Muslims. We are the ones who are most vested in speaking out and being against these types of extremists. Number one, because it's against our faith, but number two, for practical reasons, we are overwhelmingly the casualties from these extremists.
Saeed, that has been a frustration. In fact, Dawud and I have talked about it on this program a number of times. There is this frustration among, I guess what I'll say are the conventional, everyday Muslims who are continually asked to defend their faith against what the extremists are doing.
Well, frankly, it becomes quite exhausting. Partly because Muslims themselves are unable to understand what these grievances are all about. I think one thing that's really changed, particularly over the last couple of decades, is that issues which concern socioeconomic and political grievance are now being manifested within a religious narrative or a religious terminology. That becomes very confusing for those within the faith to then try to understand, because again, there's only so much empathy that somebody can have for somebody doing something, and certainly there's no empathy for people resorting to violence. And yet at the same time, when they're trying to reconcile that with their idea and their expression of Islam, it doesn't make sense at all. And so I think it's important then to delve in deeper to see what are the issues facing the Boko Haram. I mean, this is seen as a religious issue, but there is a lot of ethnic and tribal divides in Nigeria, and have been so for decades. And in the case of what we saw in Paris, a lot of socioeconomic challenges also there within the suburbs of Paris, which are inhabited by these North African Muslims.
Deeply complex. Frank, I don't know that I've ever asked you before if you agree with Bill Maher, but I'm going to give that a go. Do you see what we're watching as a continual struggle against this sort of extremism, or do you think that there are bigger problems within the faith itself that sort of becomes the petri dish for all of this to erupt?
I would never presume to say that the faith itself is the problem. I wouldn't do that. I think there are people who have hijacked it, in my own personal opinion. As I talk to people on the radio on the show, I think there's a feeling that in the Muslim community, within the Islamic faith, there's a sense that people want to see a bigger outcry against the violence. I think people are fearful. They're fearful it's going to happen to them. They're fearful that one of these shooters or suicide bombers is going to show up at Somerset Mall one day when they're there with their kids. That's what I think is going on, is there's a sense of fear about this. And whether right or wrong, I think people believe that this mindset, the violent mindset, is taught in some mosques and could even be in our community because of the number of Muslims here. So I think that's a fear factor more than anything else.
What's your take on it, Rochelle?
Well, let me address the Bill Maher point first, because I think what we tend to do in the West is to paint with a broad brush those things that we don't understand. He's talking about a few hundred people who have done some horrible things, and he wants to say that that is a part, they are bad apples in an orchard of 1.7 billion Muslims. So that shows a level of ignorance about how many people embrace Islam or who are...
I would suggest it's more than hundreds. We've got thousands of members of ISIS now and all these other groups.
But you know what? Do we really know? And even if that's the case, let's just say it's 10,000. Let's say it's 100,000. Let's say it's a million.
Still against
1 million out of 1.7 billion. So the first thing we have to do is stop assuming that it has to do with Islam. That's an easy thing for terrorists to use, but that's no different than us deciding that we're going to kick militia men who line funerals to make fun of people or who do other things and say, well, they can no longer be Christians. You can't make that choice for people, but you also are not the one who has to do it.
But you know, Dawud, we do see divides among what most Americans tend to think of as kind of the basic freedom set. It was an interesting study last year that came out on gender equality in the world. And the bottom 20 nations for women and gender equality, 19 of them were Muslim majority nations. And you would expect someplace like Yemen to be perhaps at the very bottom, which it was, but you've also got what we expect to, I think, consider modern nations in there: Lebanon, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think that a lot of Americans have trouble squaring what they see from this faith that, admittedly, they may not fully understand, but what they see, they have a discomfort with.
Well, it depends on the metrics that's being used and who's doing this measurement as well. By Western standards, perhaps many countries in the global South would not fit into this paradigm of having the same level of women's rights in comparison to the West, if the West is the standard. At the same time, the three most populous Muslim countries have had female heads of state: Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Like, we even had a female of state here yet in the United States of America. So as there needs to be, and I believe that misogyny is an international worldwide disease, like male chauvinism is something that's to be fought everywhere, including here in the United States of America. So yes, does there need to be progress in certain Muslim countries? Of course, but at the same time, I don't think that certain cultural standards of America or France should be imposed on people in the global South. I don't think it's right.
Dawud, with all due respect, I don't recall any American women being stoned to death because they were raped by men, as we have heard in Muslim countries.
That's an anomaly, but also in other countries you have the situation of female genital mutilation, right? That doesn't happen just to Muslims. That's in certain places in the world. There are people who follow traditional religions or so-called animists, as well as Christians, women who are victims of female genital mutilation as well. These type of issues just aren't Muslim specific, is what I'm saying.
Saeed, I hope I don't pay for my candor here, because I want to believe anybody can live however they want, their own sense of freedoms, the way they want to live their lives. I can't help it. When I see a woman in a burqa, I feel like I'm looking at a woman in prison. She may be if she's making that her choice, that's fine. But how do I square my view from outside the faith with your view from inside regarding women?
I think it's a very valid question, Devin, and I bring up a rather difficult subject. There was recently the daughter of Brian Williams, Allison Williams, who was on a show called Girls on HBO, in which there was a rather graphic sex scene which was depicted, and people were wondering not about whether she was comfortable with doing it. They were asking whether her father would be comfortable with this. So I think that we have cultural mores that are quite different. And certainly when we take a look at the United States and all of the debates that go on about the depiction, maybe even the objectification of women, to be thin, having to be fair-skinned, having to look good in a bikini. These are a matter of cultural difference. Now, what happens, of course, in globalization and with technology, these cultural norms are being pushed together, and we're trying to then make sense of all of these.
You've found some interesting ground there. We'll continue with that line of thought. We'll continue our conversation on Flashpoint. Quick break. Back with more right after this.